It was on a bitter January evening, with the lamps flickering weakly through the London fog, that a telegram arrived at Baker Street with news that would trouble even the calm and collected Sherlock Holmes. The message spoke of a smart gentleman from Oxford Street, a well-known and strange scholar who had vanished without even a footprint to mark his leaving. His rooms were found in a mess, books knocked over, an unfinished letter on the desk, and a faint but clear smell of tobacco sticking to the curtains, though the man himself was no smoker. To a normal mind, it might have been thought of as just a sad disappearance, yet Holmes, with his gut feeling for the dark secrets under calm waters, said right away that something far darker was happening. It was in this way that I, Dr. John Watson, was pulled once more into the show of mystery, danger, and discovery that seemed to always follow. My friend, if you, dear listener, find yourself interested by the hidden puzzles of old-time London, the gaslit streets, the dark alleys, and the endless search for truth, I invite you to stay with us. Share this journey, show your support, and join our circle of question-askers by subscribing. For many cases are still untold, and each one has inside it the same haunting chill that made me put pen to paper. The fire burned low in the grate that January evening, casting long fingers of yellow-orange light on the usual mess of our living room at 221B Baker Street. Holmes sat in his armchair, one leg crossed over the other, his thin body half covered in shadow, as the blue wisps of smoke from his pipe curled toward the ceiling. Outside, London lay quieted under a heavy curtain of fog, the rattle of carriage wheels lowered to a distant murmur, and the cries of the newspaper boys lost somewhere in the white maze. I had been trying to read, though the shifting glow of the lamps and the steady drip from the roof made focusing a weak thing. Holmes, for his part, had said barely a dozen words since dinner. He was deep in the strange silence that meant his mind was busy with some private thoughts, one finger resting lightly against his forehead, his eyes half closed, yet very much alive under their lids. It was at that hour, somewhere between the last bit of daylight and the start of full night, that a sharp knock sounded at the door below. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed along the hallway, and a moment later she appeared, breathless and a little rushed, carrying a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes stirred, his eyes flickering open with that special brightness that meant he was interested. "For you, sir," said Mrs. Hudson, and handed it to him before leaving with a ghost of a curtsy. Holmes broke the seal, quickly read what it said, and made a soft sound that was half for fun, half with excitement. "Watson," he said, passing me the slip of paper, "we are called once more into the field of action. A well-known scholar, Mr. Ambrose Chilcot, has disappeared from his rooms on Oxford Street. The message is from Inspector Lestrade, who admits he is confused. I took the telegram and read its short lines. Man missing since Thursday. Room in a mess. No sign of a fight. Suspect foul play. Request your immediate help." The words were plain and simple, yet something in the way it was written hinted at more than just official worry. Holmes had stood up now and was pacing the carpet with quick, quiet steps, his dressing gown flowing behind him like the shadow of a sail. Ambrose Chilcot, he thought out loud. The name is not new to me. I remember a speech to the Royal Society 3 years ago, a strange thinker talking about the link between what we see and what we think. He argued that knowledge, once you have it, forces a moral duty on the person who has it. Holmes's lips curved slightly. A dangerous idea, perhaps, for a man living alone among his books. "You think his disappearance may be connected with his studies?" I suggested. "My dear Watson," Holmes replied, pausing to knock the ashes from his pipe, "a man can lose himself in an idea as easily as in the Thames's fog, but the situation suggests an outside force. Rooms in a mess, yet no sign of theft. Note that. Well, such a mess is the sign of it being faked, not of a struggle. Someone wanted it to look like an accident, or like he was desperate. Therefore, we can decide that it is neither. He turned suddenly toward the fireplace shelf, where his science tools glimmered faintly in the lamplight, and pulled from the drawer a small notebook in which he recorded his cases. With a fancy flick of the pen, he made a short note. The Chilcot disappearance, Oxford Street, January 1892. Then, closing it, he slipped it into his coat pocket and began to put on his hat and scarf. "Holmes," I protested, "surely you are not planning to set out tonight? The fog is thick enough to lose a hansom cab in, and the hour is exactly the one that gives the most hiding," he interrupted with a faint smile. "Lestrade has requested we hurry, and hurry we shall. Fetch your coat, Watson. The night air will clear the cobwebs from your storytelling feelings." 10 minutes later, we went down the steps of Baker Street and were swallowed by the mist. The lamps glowed dimly like coals in a sea of smoke, and our hansom's wheels sent up a soft hissing sound from the damp cobblestones as the driver clucked to his horse. I pulled my collar high and peered out at the moving blur of people, the occasional gleam of a shop front, the ghostly shape of a police officer's lantern. Beside me, Holmes sat without moving, his face hidden in shadow, his mind already racing ahead toward the unseen scene waiting for us. "Watson," he murmured at last, "you may remember my rule that every disappearance means either running away on purpose, being taken by force, or faking one of the two. Our job is to figure out which mask the truth has chosen to wear tonight." The carriage drew up before a narrow house of dark, sooty brick, its upper windows glowing with lamplight. A police officer saluted as we got out, and Lestrade himself appeared in the doorway, his small body stiff with the feeling of being in charge. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, doctor," he greeted us quickly. "I was beginning to think you'd prefer your armchairs to real work. A strange business, this. No marks of violence, yet the man has vanished, as though the earth had swallowed him." Holmes tilted his head. "You have checked the rooms?" "Barely touched them, as you instructed in your telegram. I thought you'd want the place in its original state." Lestrade gestured for us to come inside. The scholars' rooms took up the first floor, 2 rooms connected by a short hallway, both crowded with the mess of a life spent with books. The air was heavy with the mixed smell of dust, old paper, and stale candle wax. Papers were scattered on the carpet, drawers were wide open, and yet the mess seemed strangely planned, as if chaos had been arranged with a scholar's carefulness. Holmes moved through the room with cat-like grace, pausing now and then to bend down, to lift a paper's edge with his magnifying glass, or to smell gently above a particular object. "A strange smell," he observed. "Tobacco, yet not of any English kind. Turkish, yes, and of the rougher type." Our Mr. Chilcot, however, did not like smoke of any kind, if the color change of his curtains is any sign. Therefore, the visitor smoked here, and recently. He crossed to the writing desk, where a half-written letter lay under a blotter. The ink had dried in uneven pools. The pen had fallen as though it were dropped in a hurry. "Look, Watson," he murmured. "The sentence breaks on the word knowledge. I have come to believe that knowledge itself may. And there it stops. No address, no signature." "Perhaps he was stopped," I suggested. "Without a doubt. But by whom, and for what reason?" Holmes straightened, his eyes narrowing as they traced a faint smear on the wooden floorboards. Mud, reddish in color. Brick dust from the river's south side, I should say. Our scholar had few reasons to go there. Whoever came to him tonight had traveled far across the city. Lestrade cleared his throat impatiently. "We found no footprints outside, Mr. Holmes. The sidewalk was dry until the fog came in." "Exactly," said Holmes, with quiet satisfaction. "Then the visitor arrived before the fog thickened, say between 6 and 7 o'clock. You see, Lestrade, the very lack of tracks tells us when the event happened. The inspector muttered something about your annoying ideas and turned his attention to a broken teacup on the hearth. Holmes ignored him and began to circle the room once more, his gaze darting from object to object with a focus that made talking unnecessary. At last he stopped before the narrow window. The latch had faint scratches, as though it were forced by a thin tool. Outside, the darkness pressed close, thick with mist. "Watson," he said softly, "picture our man seated here, pen in hand, when the latch moves and the window opens without a sound. A person slips inside, quiet, determined, perhaps someone he knows. Words are spoken, short and angry. Then, in the space of a heartbeat, silence. The intruder leaves, leaving a mess behind. Yet no body, no cry, no struggle. You think he was taken alive?" "I think," replied Holmes, "that he went willingly, or was convinced by something that was stronger than fear. Smart men are sometimes trapped by their own curiosity." He turned back toward Lestrade. "Have his papers been checked?" "Not yet. There are hundreds of them. Writings about deep thoughts and God knows what." Holmes's eyes flicked toward a stack of notebooks on the shelf. He chose one at random, flipped through a few pages, and smiled faintly. "Ah, as I thought. Languages, secret codes, and certain old codes from the Middle Ages. Chilcot was trying to translate codes. That is a hobby that gets attention from groups you shouldn't name." A gust of wind rattled the window panes, putting out one of the candles. The room seemed to shiver in response. Holmes replaced the notebook and spoke in a tone so low it might have been to himself. "There is a pattern here, Watson, a whisper of something larger than just a disappearance. The foreign tobacco, the unfinished letter, the faintest hint of work on codes. We stand at the doorway of a plan not yet visible, but I imagine its shape will soon appear." Lestrade gave a doubting grunt. "You'll forgive me, Mr. Holmes, but until we find a body, I'll treat it as a missing person case. The yard doesn't chase ghosts." Holmes's smile held no fun. "Then let us hope, Inspector, that the ghosts do not decide to chase you." He drew his coat closer about him and moved toward the door. "Come, Watson. There is nothing more to be learned here tonight. The air grows full of lies, and I prefer to breathe the open fog of Baker Street to the thicker fogs of not knowing." As we stepped once more into the chilly night, the lamplight flickered across Holmes's face, showing a look I had seen only a few times, a mix of excitement and a bad feeling. "You see it, do you not, Watson?" he said as we called for a cab. "There is a smart mind in this crime, and wherever a smart mind turns to evil, we may be sure the challenge will be worth the effort." The cab lurched forward, the wheels striking sparks from the stones behind us. Oxford Street lay silent, its windows covered, its mysteries sealed inside. Yet, as the mist swallowed us whole, I could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes watched from the darkness above, marking our leaving. And noting that Sherlock Holmes had entered the game, the next morning started gray and unwillingly. The kind of London morning when the fog clings low to the rooftops, as though not wanting to go away. Holmes had been awake for hours, his restless energy showing in the non-stop pacing that shook our small breakfast set on its saucers. His violin lay silent on the side table, its bow resting like an unspoken thought beside it. When I entered from my room, my coat half buttoned, he looked up with a look that mixed impatience and held back happiness. "You are late, Watson," he said, though the clock was barely at 9 o'clock. "Lestrade will already have messed up twice before his tea has cooled. We must prevent a third mistake before it makes us lose the clue completely." "I trust you slept?" I asked, pouring coffee with a hand still unsteady from the cold. He gave a short laugh. "Sleep, my dear friend? One does not sleep at the moment of creation. The case was born last night, and it cried very loudly for my attention." He held up a small scrap of paper covered in his neat handwriting. I have set down the first interesting points. Note them well. The Turkish tobacco, the reddish dust, the unfinished letter, the scratches on the window latch, and most importantly, the lack of footprints. Each detail alone is unimportant. Together, they make up the beginning of an evil song. His eyes shone with that special light which I had come to recognize as both exciting and a little scary. I have also sent for certain information, he continued, from the Oriental Club and the Foreign Office. They will teach us about the type of that tobacco. Meanwhile, we shall return to the rooms. There is something there that I even missed last night, and such a mistake on my part is something I can't stand. By 9 o'clock, we were once again rattling through the streets, the city slowly waking up under its blanket of gloom. Newspaper boys cried headlines of gossip and guessing. The disappearance had clearly caught everyone's interest. The Oxford Street mystery. They shouted, "Famous scholar disappeared. Clues suggest foreign secrets." Holmes's face hardened. The press, Watson, is a mirror that changes everything it shows. Yet sometimes, inside the change, the truth shows itself. When we arrived, Lestrade was waiting in the scholar's parlor, looking more stressed than usual. His coat was spattered with drizzle, and he greeted us with a short nod. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. We've found something new. Though I suppose you'll tell me it's not important." "On the contrary," said Holmes pleasantly, "I should be most pleased if you would allow me to make that decision myself." Lestrade pointed toward the desk. "That letter of his, the one he didn't finish. Our men found a second page hidden under the blotter. It's not finished either, but see for yourself." Holmes took the piece of paper delicately between his fingers, his eyebrows coming together as he checked the faintly inked words. "Should they come again, I shall have no choice but to reveal it. The secret cannot be kept." Then it ended, torn at the edge. "Interesting," he murmured. "The secret cannot be kept. A feeling of either hopelessness or of fighting back. Both are dangerous states of mind for a smart man." He turned it toward the light. "Note the shaking of the writing, Watson. Our scholar was very worried, yet the writing stays the same, showing choice rather than fear." He passed it back to Lestrade. "Where exactly was this found?" "Stuck under the corner of the blotter, sir." Holmes nodded without paying attention. "Not hidden with care. He meant to return to it, perhaps, or was stopped before he could destroy it." He crouched, then, scanning the carpet once more, his fingers tracing the faint marks near the hearth. "The reddish dust is not as clear this morning. The dampness in the air has dulled its color. But see here." He pulled out his magnifying glass. "Stuck between these fibers is a grain of something like a crystal. Not dust, Watson. Salt. River salt from the wharves near Blackfriars." "Then the visitor came from the river?" "Almost certainly." He stood up, his eyes glinting. "And left by the same way, if I am not mistaken." We followed him to the window. He opened it carefully, peering down at the narrow yard below. The wall was damp and green with moss, but there, just visible to my eye, were faint scrapes on the brick. "A rope," Holmes murmured. He climbed up from the alley. "See the spacing? A light man used to climbing. Perhaps a sailor or a dockhand." He entered unseen, left silently. "Wonderful skill." Lestrade frowned. "But why not simply knock at the door?" "Because, Inspector," Holmes said gently, "men who deal with secrets you shouldn't touch seldom call in the daylight or at the front steps." We returned inside, and Holmes's gaze settled on a small glass cover on the fireplace shelf, under which lay several strange objects. A feather, a coin from another country, and a tiny piece of pale stone carved with symbols, so faint they might have been scratches. He lifted the cover and turned the piece toward the light. "An ancient writing," he said after a moment. "Early Babylonian, if I'm not wrong. So, Our Mr. Chilcot had a liking for old things. That places him in a circle of scholars, both respectable and, shall we say, not so respectable. There are dealers who would pay a lot for such old things. Lestrade shrugged. You think he was robbed, then? Had he been, Inspector, the cover would be empty. No, this was not theft. It was a deal, or forcing someone while pretending it's a deal. Holmes replaced the object carefully and moved to the doorway that led to the next room. It was a smaller room, more plain, with little beyond the bed, a wardrobe, and a writing stand. The window looked out onto the street, now half hidden by the rising fog. Holmes stood there in silence for a long while, his gaze shifting between the bedclothes, the wall, and the mirror above the washstand. I had learned better than to interrupt these times of deep thought. Finally, he spoke. Watson, note the mirror. See the small tilt downward. It reflects not the face of one standing before it, but the window behind. A safety measure, perhaps, or a habit from being suspicious. Chilcot feared being watched. You mean he expected to be watched? Exactly. And yet he stayed. That is the puzzle that troubles me most. A man who fears being found out, and yet refuses to run, must believe he is the protector of something worth the risk. As he spoke, a sharp knock sounded from the hall. Mrs. Renshaw. The landlady entered, a small woman with a nervous face, clutching her apron. Beg pardon, sirs, but I thought I ought to mention it. There was a gentleman here 2 nights ago, before all this trouble began. Dark coat, foreign accent. He asked after Mr. Chilcot and left his card. Holmes held out his hand. The card, if you please. She pulled out a thin square of white card, slightly stained at the corner. On it was engraved in neat black script, Mr. Armand Lefebvre, Rue de Mathieu, Paris. Holmes's face sharpened. Ah, the story gets more complicated. A Frenchman asking about a Babylonian scholar on Oxford Street. Tell me, madam, did this Mr. Lefebvre return? No, sir, not that I've seen. But there was another, tall with a scarf around his throat. He came later the same evening. He waited below for nearly an hour, pacing back and forth terribly, and then went off when the fog came in. Holmes nodded gravely. You have been most helpful, Mrs. Renshaw. One final question. Did your lodger receive letters often? Oh, yes, sir. Almost daily. Foreign stamps, too. I remember one from Constantinople, not 3 weeks ago. When she had gone, Holmes turned to me with quiet satisfaction. Constantinople, Paris, and the riverfront of London. The triangle closes, Watson. Our scholar was involved in matters that went beyond just schoolwork. Lestrade snorted. You'll be telling me next he was part of a secret society. Holmes smiled faintly. If he was, Inspector, he chose his friends poorly. He drew from his pocket the matchbox we had found the night before. Note the maker's mark. C. Almany, Marseille. Imported, uncommon. And yet the same smell of Turkish tobacco clings to it. Our Frenchman smokes as his Eastern friends do. He replaced it and gestured for me to follow. Come, Watson. There is nothing more to be gained by staring at the empty space where a man once stood. But I would know what force carried him from his rooms, and for that we must visit the river. As we went down, Lestrade called after him. You'll be chasing after nothing before noon, Mr. Holmes? Holmes paused at the doorway, the fog blowing about his hat and shoulders like smoke. Ghosts, perhaps, he said softly. But ghosts leave traces where men do not. And if Mr. Chilcot walks among them, I plan to learn what drew him across that doorway. The cab carried us southward through the city's heart, past markets just waking up to business, past beggars warming their hands at the grates, past the endless crowd of people that London sent out each morning. Holmes stayed silent, eyes half closed, fingers steepled under his chin. At last he spoke, almost to himself. A man receives letters from Constantinople, has a French visitor, studies ancient symbols, and disappears, hidden by the fog. There is a plan here, Watson. A plan and a meaning. But the key lies not in his learning, but in what he feared it might reveal. I watched him as the cab wheels splashed through the river's darkness. His gaze was fixed on some invisible horizon, and for the briefest instant I thought that Holmes himself was trapped by the same interest that had claimed the vanished scholar. There are depths, I thought, into which even the sharpest mind might look for too long. The fog thickened once more as we reached the riverbank, swallowing the shapes of the city in its damp hug. Somewhere beyond that gray curtain, the Thames rolled on, silent, not caring, and yet perhaps holding in its cold water the first true whisper of what had become of the vanished scholar of Oxford Street. The fog had not lifted when we returned to Oxford Street, but it had thinned to a skin upon the air, a see-through cloth through which the morning traffic showed. Like shapes in a pale fish tank, Mrs. Renshaw met us on the stairs with that worried politeness which seems the natural shield of a respectable landlady in times of trouble. She led us into a small parlor, whose furniture covers were as stiff as her manner, then folded her hands and waited as though for a decision. Holmes, who could be the most polite of men when information was at stake, thanked her seriously and asked with a bow that she retell from the beginning her knowledge of Mr. Ambrose Chilcott's movements during the week of his disappearance. She took a breath and began, at first in shaky bits, and then with a steadier flow. As Holmes's quiet listening invited her to feel safe, Mr. Chilcott had been a man on time in all house matters. She said, regular in his meals, careful with his money, and always polite, though he was known for being so lost in thought that he would forget his hat or lose his keys. The week before, he had ordered an extra lamp for his study and asked that the curtains be lined more thickly, jobs which he had done with some trouble, and a note on the rent for the material. He had said no to dinner 2 nights in a row, saying he had work, and once, here her voice fell. She had heard voices in the study after 11 o'clock, low and urgent. When she dared to go upstairs to ask if he needed tea, she found the door locked and no answer came. In the morning, he had apologized, saying he had a bout of nerves and a restless night. Holmes's eyes had chosen their half-closed look, the lids lowered, but the mind behind them burning like a fire. These late voices, were they in English? I could not say, sir. It seemed, she frowned, searching for the right word. It seemed rounder in the vowels than ours, if you understand me. Not German, exactly, and not French, like a lady learns at school. Perhaps from the Middle East, I murmured. Holmes did not glance at me, but the corner of his mouth bent almost too small to see. Continue, if you please. On the day itself. Thursday, Mr. Chilcott had eaten a light breakfast, walked out at 10 with a bundle of papers under his arm, and returned before noon with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with blue string. He had stayed in his rooms until evening. Then, at 7:15, there had been a light knock, which she recognized as the way the milk boy knocked, though when she opened the door, no one was there. She forgot about the incident until half an hour later she smelled smoke, a sweet, sticky smell unlike any candle or coal she knew. By the time she crossed the landing to comment on it, the study was quiet. She had tapped. There was no answer. She had tapped again more boldly. Still nothing. Fear, she admitted, held her tongue, and when at last she opened the door with her key, the room lay empty, the window unlatched, the papers scattered like a startled flock of birds. She had sent for the police officer at once. Holmes's questions, when they came, were of the kind that seemed small to a normal person and very important to him. Had any tradesman called that day? A cleaning lady? A book dealer? She produced a memory of the mailman, too. A foreign envelope with a stamp showing a domed skyline and writing that ran together like threads. Holmes glanced at me. Constantinople, he said, the words barely able to be heard. Had she kept the wrapper? She had, out of being thrifty, for it was good paper, though she had cut it to line a drawer. At Holmes's request, she flew to get it, and returned with 2 tidy rectangles, whose outer edges still kept the blur of foreign ink. He checked them very closely with his magnifying glass, then held one to the light and tilted his head in satisfaction. The grain of the paper, he observed, is unusually long, the fibers running like river reeds. Within its weave, at a certain angle, a faint oval symbol appeared. No clear letters, only the ghost of a laurel wreath and what might have been a torch. "Madam," he said with quiet respect, "you have saved more than a wrapper. You have saved a piece of the hand that drew your lodger from safety." She blushed with a mix of fear and pride. And Holmes, having calmed her with a few murmured words in that rare, gentle tone of his, asked that she bring us the cleaning lady, the shoe-shine boy who waited sometimes in the alley, the milk boy, if he could be brought, and any neighbor who had seen comings and goings these past evenings. While she went on this task, like a general getting his troops in order, Holmes crossed to the study and stood quite still, to listen. I have learned that his silences can be as meaningful as another man's loud statements. After a long minute, he touched the back of the chair where Chilcot would have sat, raised his fingers, and frowned over a faint stickiness. He sniffed briefly and nodded to himself. "Resin," he said. "Not from the fireplace. From the hands of our caller. The same sweet smell the landlady noted. Not the same. Related. The smoke she smelled was a leaf. The sticky stuff here is a gum." He closed his eyes. "Picture it, Watson. A man used to rope and river, with the smell of the Middle East in his clothes, climbs into a scholar's room from the alley as the fog thickens. A second man may have already come and gone by the door. There are voices. There is an object being argued over. Perhaps not money, for no drawer stands empty, but knowledge put onto paper, stone, or mind. By the end of the hour, the scholar is no longer there. The question that remains most important is not how, but why. The how, you see, has already begun to confess itself. One by one, the other people in Oxford Street's small show filed through the parlor. The cleaning lady, her hands red from soap and vinegar. The milk boy, whose nervous bobbing could have churned butter inside him. The shoe-shine boy, a wide-eyed boy with hands like night and a quickness in his speech, born from having to be fast. The cleaning lady had nothing to add except that the dust she swept Friday morning had turned to a smear under the broom. "River damp," said Holmes, and thanked her. The milk boy reported that a gentleman had indeed questioned him 2 days earlier about the landlady's routine. Did she sit in the kitchen after supper? How long before she went to bed? The boy had given him short answers, wanting only to be done, for the gentleman's stare had made him feel as though he were being judged for his worth. Did he speak like a Frenchman? Holmes asked. The boy shrugged. To him, all fancy voices were the same in their strangeness. The shoe-shine boy brought the first clean piece of new information. He worked late, he said, under the lamp at the corner, and on Wednesday night, note that the night before the disappearance, he had seen a gentleman standing very still across the way, his scarf high and his hat pulled low, watching the house as though it might open on its own. Once the watcher had turned to look down the alley, as if expecting a signal, and in that motion, the lamplight had caught something at his throat. A thin ring of metal set flat against the skin. The boy had never seen such a thing, except on sailors who wore charms against drowning. A tattoo? I suggested. Holmes shook his head. More modern. A collar of some sort, or the band of a medical tool. The detail may be unimportant, he added, though his tone made it clear he did not think so. Men who believe they are protected take their courage too far. At Holmes's request, Mrs. Renshaw next brought a neighbor from across the landing, a music teacher, whose neat beard and careful speech suggested a life measured in music notes. This gentleman declared that on Thursday at 6 o'clock he had heard a rhythmic tapping through the wall. 3 taps, a pause, then 2. A pattern repeated softly, as if to check itself. He had thought at first of pipes or some slow-witted suitor signaling, but the regularity was too planned. Holmes's eyes brightened. A code, perhaps? Thank you, sir. You have done us a great service. Should you hear such taps again, I beg you to take exact note of their order. The teacher promised, happy to find his ear being used to help Sherlock Holmes. When at last the line of people had ended, and Mrs. Renshaw's parlor went back to its stiff quietness, Holmes stood and looked at the door to Chilcott's study as a doctor might look at a patient who hides his sickness with stubborn pride. We have, then, he said softly, voices after 11 o'clock in a language not English. A foreign envelope whose maker's mark is colored with laurel. Resin on the chair back that speaks of hands busy with rope or with rolled leaf. A watcher in the street marked by a strange band at his throat, and a pattern of tapping like a quiet drum at the wall. He looked to Lestrade, who had arrived halfway through these stories, and had taken notes with the patient doubt of his kind. You will have your men ask at the post office, and the bookshops along the Strand for packages addressed to Mr. Chilcott, and you will ask at the docks for any worker who wears a band of metal at his neck. The Strand? Lestrade barked. What's the Strand to do with this? Holmes's gaze twinkled like a knife when it catches the sun. Where else does the river speak to the pen? Printers, stationers, foreign writers. Knowledge has its water gates, Inspector, and the Strand is one of them. To me, he added in a lower voice, we must also learn more of our Paris friend, Mr. Armand Lefebvre of the Rue de Matcher. The Foreign Office may have some small knowledge of the gentleman's activities. Before we left, Holmes returned once more to the desk, where the unfinished letter lay, its broken sentence a torn thread in the middle of a mess. He lifted the sheet delicately by the corner, turned it toward the window, and held it so the weak daylight passed through. The paper thinned until it was see-through, and very slowly, like ink coming to the surface, an oval shape appeared at the top edge, the twin of the laurel ghost we had seen on the wrapper. Inside it, I thought a torch did indeed lift its flames. He lowered the page, and for the first time that morning, a shade of real worry crossed his face. So, he said, this is no common note paper one finds at a stationer's. Whoever supplied it wished to tie the contents with a mark, a promise, or a warning. Look at the fibers, long, strong, woven for the difficulties of travel. This leaf was meant to cross distances and to survive being handled. Our scholar's message was meant to go far. And yet it never went, I said. On the contrary, Holmes replied, I suspect it went further than its writer. He slipped the page between 2 clean sheets as gently as though it were a sample fresh from being studied. Then he bowed to Mrs. Renshaw with old-world politeness and told her that for now the room was to remain untouched, the window not to be opened, and the fireplace not to be cleared. You have my promise, madam, he added, that we shall act with all care. The name of your house, and indeed of your neighborhood, will not suffer by my hand. Outside, the day had climbed to that one flat part which in London passes for noon. We walked a little way in silence, our boots sounding on the stone paths with the serious rhythm that an investigation forces. Soon Holmes called for a hansom cab, and we climbed inside. For a time he stared through the slit of the driver's apron, and when he spoke, it was with that inwardness which told me he was talking to the problem rather than to his friend. Consider, Watson. A man spends his life studying signs, and then he is taken by men who deal in signs. He arms himself with mirrors and heavy curtains. He listens for taps through the wall. He stocks his desk with paper that has a laurel brand, whose origin we can only guess. When at last he writes the sentence that condemns or saves him, the secret cannot be kept. Someone climbs from the river to collect it. Such men believe in the power of ceremony. They leave the mark of their supplier. They prefer rope to stairs, smoke to talk, night to day. Where then would they meet a scholar who still hesitates between courage and giving up? At the place where knowledge becomes a product, I said, catching his meaning. At the shop that sells paper to men who trade in it. Just so. He rapped the roof. Baker Street first. We must examine this watermark in proper light. Then the Strand. As the cab turned, I watched Oxford Street shrink behind us, its shop windows blinking like tired eyes, and its upper stories as watchful as ever. Somewhere beyond those windows, Ambrose Chilcot had listened to a code tapped through plaster. Somewhere along the river, a man with resin on his hands had coiled a rope and looked up for a signal. The web held. One could feel it in the air, a faint tension, as when a spider senses its prey's shiver. Holmes's face settled into its look of purest focus. In the half-light of the hansom cab, he looked not just sharp, but serious, as if the case had woken in him a private love for the clean line, from clue to cause. We reached Baker Street with the determination that comes before action, and went up at once to our rooms, where the familiar jumble of science tools and books waited like obedient soldiers. Holmes cleared a space on the table, lit the lamp so that its beam fell at an angle, and set the unfinished page on a black card. As the warmth drew out the faintest oil from the fibers, the symbol woke up fully, the laurel, the torch, and under them the shadow of letters that might, with patience and the right kind of light, declare where they came from. Holmes bent close, and I, standing at his shoulder, felt that strange stirring of the nerves which always comes with the moment when scattered pieces begin to line up. "Now," he said very softly, "let us see what your paper has to tell us that your pen could not." Fog and coal smoke rolled together across the river like twin snakes twisting in a slow hug. By the time we reached the Strand, the lamps burned pale inside their own halos, and the shop fronts crouched behind curtains of dirt. Holmes, wrapped to the chin in his overcoat, scanned each sign with the restless exactness of a surveyor. "Note the grouping, Watson," he murmured. "Publishers, engravers, stationers, foreign writers. Every kind of business that lives on the written word. If our vanished scholar dealt in secret paper, its trail must wind through this street." We passed 2 newsstands, a shop of photographic plates, and a seller of sea charts before Holmes stopped suddenly before a narrow doorway marked only by a brass plate engraved. Penhaligon and Sons, fine papers, seals, stationery. A dim inside showed through the glass, shelves of parchment, bolts of watermarked paper, and a clerk hunched like a bird over a big book. Holmes entered without knocking, and I followed, aware of the change that came over him when curiosity grew into certainty. His politeness grew sharper, his voice softened, and his eyes took on that special brightness which to someone who didn't know him might have seemed friendly, but to me always meant danger was closing its net. The clerk, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, looked up. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Holmes removed his hat with old-fashioned grace. "You may indeed. I am in search of a particular make of writing paper, extra fine of foreign fiber, bearing an oval watermark made of laurel leaves around a torch." The young man's forehead wrinkled. "We carry many watermarks, sir, but that design I do not remember." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then you are new to the business." A deeper voice spoke from the shadows behind the counter. "Not so new that I cannot answer for my stock. A heavy-set man with graying whiskers came out, wiping his hands on a cloth. Arthur Penhaligon, owner. You described the Laureate brand, I believe. A limited import from Europe. We handled a shipment last autumn. Holmes tilted his head. From whom did you get it? Through a dealer in Paris. Monsieur ... Pardon, sir, Messrs. Lefebvre and Company. At the sound of that name, Holmes's gaze flickered to me for the briefest moment. Indeed. And was the supply large? 3 reams only, of a very special pulp. We sold them within the month. 2 to the Foreign Office, 1 to a private client, whose messenger paid in gold coins and gave no address. Would you happen to remember the date of that final sale? The stationer frowned, looking through his big book. The 10th of November. Holmes drew a breath so light it barely stirred the air. You are most helpful, Mr. Penhaligon. If you will allow me to buy a single sheet of the same paper, I should be very grateful. The man hesitated. We have none left, I fear, except a sample or 2 kept for reference. Then I must ask for your kindness. Penhaligon, subdued by Holmes's politeness, got from a drawer a small folder and lifted out 1 sheet. Holmes held it against the light. The watermark glimmered, exactly like the one we had seen. He slipped it into his case and placed a gold coin on the counter. One cannot overpay for truth, he said, and we left. Outside, the fog had thickened, muffling the clip of hooves. Holmes walked in silence until we reached a corner where a street lamp burned with a shaky flame. There he stopped, his breath rising in pale wisps. The chain tightens, Watson. Lefebvre of Paris supplies the paper. The same Lefebvre whose card lies on Chilcott's desk. 3 reams, 1 to the government, 1 to a disappearance. There is meaning in such math. He called for a cab and gave the driver an address in Wapping. To the river again, he said when we were seated. Where there is trade in paper, there is trade in men. I would know who carried those packages across the channel. The journey took us eastward through narrowing streets, whose stones sweated tar and seawater. The air grew smelly with hempen bilge, the cries of dock workers rising and falling like some ancient song. At the lower wharves, the fog was a real thing, crawling along the planks and wrapping itself around the tied-up ships. Holmes moved with confidence, born of knowing such scenes before. He was as much at home in the dirtiness of the docks as in the fancy living rooms of Mayfair. We found our man in a tavern whose windows glowed with the orange smear of lamp oil. Inside, the heat and stench struck like a blow. Sailors drank in close-packed groups, their laughter loud, their faces carved with salt and hardship. Behind the counter, a stout woman drew ale with both hands, and in the corner, a thin fiddler sawed without rhythm. Holmes threaded through the crowd to a table where a small fellow with a sailor's walk was counting coins on the wood. You are Jack Hanby, lately of the Artemis? Holmes asked. The man looked up sharply. Who wants to know? A friend of Mr. Lefebvre's shipments. The effect was instant. Hanby's eyes darted toward the door, then back to Holmes. I don't care for the French no more, he muttered. Too many questions. Not enough answers. Holmes seated himself opposite and gestured for 2 ales. Then allow me to ask one more. Do you remember delivering crates of fine stationery last November? Hanby wiped his mouth. Aye, that I do. Small boxes, light as sign. Came off the Belle Helene, out of Calais. We took them up river to Penhaligon's place. But there was another stop before. The same stuff, same marks, unloaded near Blackfriars to a gentleman in a black coat. Said he was collecting samples for a society of scholars. Holmes leaned forward. Describe him. Tall, spoke soft like a priest. Had a scarf tied close around his neck, like he was afraid of a draught. Holmes's hand closed briefly on the table edge. I saw the knuckles whiten. Did he have any sign on him? A ring, perhaps, or a medal. A small brass token, Handy said, round as a crown piece, hanging from that scarf of his. Never saw the like. Gave me half a gold coin and vanished into the fog. Would you know him again? I'd know the voice. Sounded educated, but tired. Holmes stood. If the police should ask, you have seen nothing, heard nothing, and will forget my face until I choose to remind you. He tossed a coin on the table and turned toward the door. Outside, the wind off the river cut like a blade. Holmes walked briskly until we were clear of the tavern's glow, then slowed, his head bent. We have met our man before, Watson. A watcher with the banded throat. Lefebvre's partner, if not Lefebvre himself. He moves between scholar and smuggler, between ink and river mud. And Chilcot, poor fool, wrote to him in the belief he was dealing with a fellow academic. What could they have been trading, Holmes? Secrets of state? Old treasures? Holmes's gaze drifted to the river, whose black surface mirrored the trembling lamps. Perhaps something older and less forgivable. Ideas, Watson. Those are the true illegal goods of Europe. A dangerous new idea whispered from one mind to another, hidden in letters wrapped in laurel paper. We climbed the steps from the wharf to a narrow lane where the fog thinned and the sound of the city went back to its steady pulse. Holmes called a passing police officer and told him to carry word to Lestrade that the case now stretched across the channel. The officer saluted, half confused, half proud, and trudged away. Holmes started his walk again, his long shadow sliding before him on the wet stones. "Do you remember," he said, "the phrase in Chilcot's letter, 'The secret cannot be kept'? Suppose, then, that it was not a confession but a warning. Suppose he meant that the thing he had uncovered was of such a nature that hiding it was impossible, that it would spread itself like a sickness. If so, his disappearance was not just to silence him, but to prevent the sickness from spreading. I shivered, even though I had a heavy coat. "You speak as if of a disease." "In a sense, it is one," Holmes said quietly. "An intellectual disease. There are truths which, once spoken, destroy the very idea of authority. Such truths are feared more than dynamite. They must be buried together with the person who found them." We reached the end of the lane where a lamplighter was at work, his pole raised into the fog. Holmes paused, watching the small flame catch and steady itself. "Light, Watson," he said almost dreamily. "It shows, and yet it burns. I wonder how many scholars before Chilcot have been eaten by the fire they started." His daydream lasted but a heartbeat. Then he straightened, the thinking gleam returning. "Come, we must send a wire to Paris. There is a man at the Screet who owes me a favor. If Lefebvre still walks the Rue de Matcher, he will be under watch before midnight." We found a telegraph office near the bridge, and Holmes wrote his message in French, so short and sharp it might have been carved in steel. When the clerk had sent it, Holmes turned to me with the first sign of tiredness I had seen since the case began. "We shall wait for his reply at Baker Street. Until then, we can only rebuild the pattern." Back in our rooms, the lamps glowed warm against the cold outside. Holmes spread the papers on the table, the telegram, the sheet of laurel paper, the notes from Lestrade, and the piece of the letter. "Look, Watson. Lefebvre supplies the paper. Lefebvre visits Chilcot. A man wearing Lefebvre's scarf is seen at the window. A French ship brings the same paper to London, and Chilcot disappears. The chain is closed, yet the reason is still hidden." He struck a match and lit his pipe, the smoke curling upward like a thought made visible. "I have written before that crime is seldom original. Yet I begin to suspect this case comes close to the edge of that rule. We stand at the doorway of something unique, neither political nor personal, but deep in its scariness." He rose and went to the window, looking down into the misty street where gaslight shimmered on wet stone. The scholar, the Frenchman, the paper, the code tapped through the wall. They are pieces of one plan. When the answer comes from Paris, Watson, it will tell us whether we hunt a murderer or a missionary. Outside, a carriage rattled past, its wheels splashing through puddles that caught the lamplight pieces of gold. Holmes's shadow stood against the curtain, tall and still, while the smoke of his pipe rose like incense before an altar to reason. Somewhere beyond that curtain of fog, the river sighed, and I felt that London itself was listening, waiting, as we were, for the next discovery in the vanishing of the scholar of Oxford Street. The telegram from Paris arrived 2 mornings later, slipped quietly under our door by Mrs. Hudson, who announced its coming with a voice both worried and annoyed. Holmes tore it open with a quick flick of his long fingers, his eyes scanning the lines so fast I could barely follow their movement. Then, without a word, he handed it to me. The message was in a secret code, a short group of letters and numbers that to my untrained eye might have been a random mess. Yet Holmes had already crossed to his desk, where his notebooks lay like a surgeon's tools waiting for the next surgery. "Gautier has done better than I expected," he murmured, drawing a series of marks on the paper. "The old switching code, one of ours from the Balkan case. Here, Watson, look." When rearranged, the message reads, "Lefebvre dead. Found insane. Papers missing. Mark upon neck. Circle of laurel and torch." I repeated the last phrase, the same as the watermark. "The very same," said Holmes, his voice low and quick. "Our Parisian friend, it seems, has paid the price of being involved. The mark on his neck, perhaps a token, perhaps a sentence. Either way, the circle closes tighter." He leaned back in his chair, the telegram still in his hand. Lefebvre dead. Chilcot vanished. The flame burns both the scholar and the messenger. He stood up suddenly and crossed to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Outside, the London fog lay thin but stubborn, spreading the pale daylight into a ghostly glow. "There is a pattern here, Watson, if only I can grab its rhythm. 2 men connected by a common search. One disappears, the other dies, marked by the same symbol they shared. What joins them is neither theft nor murder, but knowledge, and knowledge of a kind that kills." "You speak as though the thing itself were poisonous," I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "Poison does not have to be something you can touch, my dear fellow. An idea may kill more surely than any poison made by chemists. There are truths that shake the foundations on which men build their sanity." He turned from the window, his gaze sharp once more. "Come, we shall call on Lestrade. The Yard will have received news of Lefebvre's death by now, though probably without the faintest idea of what it means." When we arrived at Scotland Yard, the inspector was seated behind his desk, his face showing the grim satisfaction of a man proven right by chance. "You'll be pleased to hear, Mr. Holmes," he said, "that your French acquaintance has turned up floating face down near a bridge in Paris. Stabbed, most likely, though the report is thin. The Foreign Office has already sent their regrets. It seems the fellow was mixed up with certain groups of questionable reputation." Holmes tilted his head. "And the scholar, Inspector? Any word?" "None. Not a trace since your last visit? My men have searched the river and the surrounding streets. Either he's fled the country or joined his friend under the water." Holmes's tone stayed polite, but his eyes showed impatience. "And the papers found on Lefebvre's body?" "None worth mentioning. A few scraps of code, a foreign passport, and a small disc of brass with some strange symbol on it, burned into the flesh of his neck, mind you, as if it were heated." The French police were puzzled. Holmes drew a slow breath. "A brand, then, not a decoration." "Just so," said Lestrade with a shrug. "Some foreign secret society, perhaps. There's no shortage of them. We have our own hands full with honest British thieves." Holmes's lips twitched in the shadow of a smile. Indeed. And yet, Inspector, you might consider that this foreign brotherhood has chosen London as the stage for its latest act. Should their work prove catching, you may soon find your list of cases somewhat larger. Lestrade scowled. You'll forgive me if I prefer my cases with bodies attached. Holmes bowed. You shall have one soon enough, I fear. Come, Watson. Outside, as we went down the steps into the noise of Whitehall, Holmes walked in silence for several paces, the telegram folded neatly in his hand. A brand of laurel and torch, he said at last. It is a symbol older than any political order, yet can be adapted to all. Laurel for victory, torch for enlightenment, the twin idols of smart people. A brotherhood, perhaps, that believes knowledge itself should be guarded as a holy flame. And Chilcot, in his passion, may have gone against that belief. We turned eastward, where the spires of the city rose like jagged teeth through the mist. Holmes called for a cab and gave the driver the address of the British Museum. If Chilcot was indeed a scholar of such interests, he explained, his letters, his references, his entire web of contacts will trace through the reading room. It is there, Watson, that the true digging for thoughts may be done. Inside that great round room, the air hung heavy with the perfume of dust and ink. The hush of turning pages was like the whisper of an unseen ocean. We found the head librarian, a serious man with glasses that clip on the nose, who received Holmes's papers with suspicion that softened into unwilling respect. At Holmes's request, he brought the book of visitors for the past month. Holmes's eyes darted down the columns until he stopped at a familiar name. Ambrose Chilcot, he murmured. Here, 3 times in the week before his disappearance. And see, under his signature, always the same second name, written in the same hand, A. Morar. The librarian adjusted his glasses. That would be Mr. Adrien Morar, a European scholar who studied something not many people know about. He worked under a temporary permit, foreign, perhaps Hungarian. We thought he was a loner. He left suddenly 10 days ago without collecting his papers. Holmes's face sharpened. You remember what he looked like? Tall, pale, with a voice of great softness. He wore a scarf about his neck at all times. I assumed he had some sickness of the throat. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. Our man again. Did he and Mr. Chilcot work together? I asked. The librarian nodded. Side by side, though they seldom spoke. Yet I saw once that they exchanged a slip of paper no larger than a bookmark, and Mr. Chilcot placed it inside his wallet with clear care. Holmes's eyes gleamed. You have been of the greatest help, sir. When we stepped back into the pale daylight, Holmes's walk had grown tight with purpose. Watson, remember the matchbox found at the scene? Marseille make, Turkish tobacco. Morar, or whatever name he uses, comes from the east by way of France. He uses Lefebvre's channel for letters, his brand for joining the group. Chilcot, meanwhile, works beside him, not knowing, until at last he figures out the code and understands too much. You believe Morar silenced him? Holmes's gaze turned inward. If silence were the goal, why the fancy staging of a mess? No, Watson. The goal was not just to remove, but to change, to take a smart mind and turn it toward their purpose. If Chilcot lives, he lives not as a victim, but as a follower. The thought chilled me. Then he has joined them, perhaps unwillingly, perhaps convinced by the logic of terror. There are ways of convincing that are more subtle than force. He stopped suddenly. We must test the idea. There is an address registered under Morar's permit, a room in Bloomsbury. Come, there is daylight yet. The rooms we looked for lay in a quiet, curved row of old houses near Russell Square. A brass plate had the name A. Morar, linguist. Holmes tried the bell. No answer. He took out his lockpicks with that calm skill which I, as a doctor, could not help but admire for its surgical grace. In less than a minute, the door gave way. The inside was in orderly neglect, a scholar's den, but stripped of life. Shelves of books in French, Greek, and Arabic lined the walls. On the table, a half-burned candle, a scrap of paper, and the lingering smell of something sweet and sticky. Holmes bent over the scrap. On it was drawn the same symbol, the laurel and the torch, circled by words in Latin. Lux docet, sed yaret, said Holmes grimly. Light teaches, but burns. A fitting motto. Our brotherhood names itself. He checked the floor, then the window latch, then the fireplace. He left in a hurry, but not in fear. There, Watson, the ash of the same Turkish blend. He left within the hour of the Faber's death. News travels quickly among people in a secret plan. In a small cupboard, Holmes found a package tied with string. He opened it carefully. Inside lay a bundle of blank sheets, the same watermarked paper. Under them, a single envelope addressed in a neat hand. To be delivered to Mr. Ambrose Chilcot, Oxford Street, upon my safe return. It was sealed, but Holmes held it against the light. Inside was nothing visible, only a faint glimmer, as though the paper itself had some hidden writing. Secret ink, Holmes murmured. He meant to reveal it later by heat, but we will beat him to it. We carried the letter back to Baker Street, where Holmes set about his experiment with all the controlled excitement of a chemist at the edge of discovery. He lit the spirit lamp, adjusted the distance, and held the page above the rising warmth. Slowly, as though called from within, lines began to appear, thin, shaky, but clearly formed by a human hand. Holmes read aloud, "The flame travels north. When the scholar understands, the circle shall be unbroken. Seek not the bearer of the torch, for he walks already among you." The final words shook and blurred as the heat ate the rest. Holmes laid the paper down with care. "It is as I feared," he said softly. "This is no crime of greed or jealousy, but of joining a group. Chilcot was not murdered. He was chosen." The room seemed to shrink around us. Outside, the fog pressed once more against the window panes, and a faint sound, the creak of a cab turning in the street, broke the silence. Holmes's eyes flicked toward the window. "Watson," he said quietly, "draw the curtain. It appears that our caller from Oxford Street has remembered our address." I crossed the room and looked out. A figure stood across the way under the lamplight, not moving, its face unclear, but its posture clearly watchful. As I reached for the cord, the figure turned and vanished into the fog. Holmes's face hardened. The circle closes indeed. And now, Watson, the real contest begins. The night that followed was one of those rare times when London itself seemed to share our worry. The air had grown strangely still, and the fog, though thinner than before, hung in slow-moving trails along the gutters, like something alive and not wanting to leave. Holmes did not sleep. I woke twice in the early hours to see him outlined against the fire, his dressing gown drawn tight, his violin lying across his knees. Once he drew the bow across the strings in a single whispering sound, a long, sad note that might have been the sigh of the city itself. When morning came, I found him at the table, the leftovers of our midnight experiment scattered around him, chemical stains, glass slides, and the burnt corners of paper with half-faded Latin phrases. "Good heavens, Holmes," I exclaimed. "You've been at it all night." He glanced up, his eyes ringed with red, but clear as ever. "The ink, Watson, the secret ink. It contains not the usual stuff of cobalt or lemon, but the sticky leftovers of gum mixed with oil of bergamot. It is the same substance I found on the chair at Chilcot's rooms." "You mean the resin from the hands of his visitor?" "Exactly. A custom mix, one made to react not just to heat, but to a special kind of light. Look. He turned down the lamp, struck a match, and held the flame behind a piece of the letter. The faint writing flared once more into words we could read, showing an extra line that we had missed before. The torchbearer shall show himself where laurel meets stone. Holmes's hand trembled very slightly as he lowered the paper. It is a meeting place, Watson, an instruction. And if I am not mistaken, it refers to St. Paul's Cathedral. Where else does laurel meet stone? The steps of that great monument are carved with wreaths of victory. Laurel, marble, and shadow. A poetic way of speaking for a group that thinks of itself as the guardian of light. He began to pace the room, the floorboards creaking under his measured walk. We have so far chased the scholar, the messenger, and the philosopher. Now we must meet the belief itself. Lestrade will come with us, though he will complain. I want the yard's presence to be felt, if not understood. There is danger here. Danger of the most unclear, and therefore the most powerful kind. By noon we stood before the western steps of St. Paul's, the city humming around us in its uncaring routine. The sky hung low and lead-colored. Holmes looked at the huge front of the building, its carvings half hidden by soot, and pointed toward the south side, where scaffolding rose against the stone. There, he murmured. Restoration of the carved band. Laurel wreaths newly cleaned. If their message is real, we shall find a sign of it nearby. We went up the steps. Lestrade, puffing and unhappy, followed a few paces behind, his bowler hat gleaming damply. I hope this isn't one of your symbolic wild goose chases, Mr. Holmes, he muttered. The yard has little patience for poetry. Then today, Inspector, Holmes replied. You may consider it an education. As we neared the scaffolding, Holmes's gaze sharpened. A small bundle of papers lay half hidden beside a stone column, damp but not ruined. He knelt, lifted them with his gloved hand, and turned them over. On the top page was the familiar symbol of laurel and torch, pressed faintly into the paper. Left for collection, he whispered. Someone was to get them today. At that very moment, a movement in the crowd below caught my eye. A figure in a long black coat, his face hidden by the brim of a hat, standing perfectly still in the middle of the swirl of people passing by. I touched Holmes's sleeve, but even as I did so, the man turned and began to walk swiftly down the steps, disappearing toward Ludgate Hill. After him, cried Holmes, jumping to his feet. We gave chase, Lestrade grumbling behind us. The man moved with surprising quickness, weaving through carts and people, his coat flaring behind him like a wing. Twice Holmes nearly caught up to him, but each time the man darted into a side street and vanished into the mist that hung between the warehouses. At last, near Paternoster Row, we found ourselves alone before a dead end. A wall wet with dampness, a locked gate, and no trace of the runaway. Holmes stood quite still, breathing evenly even after the hard work. He knows the ground, he said quietly. This was no common escape. It was a test. He wished to measure our chase. He turned to me suddenly. Did you notice his walk, Watson? Long steps, a slight limp. The right leg, I said. Excellent. You begin to observe, not just to see. That limp may help us yet. We returned to St. Paul's to check the papers we had found. Inside the bundle were several pages of code, lines of numbers arranged in 3 columns, and at the bottom of each a seal in red wax with the laurel symbol. Holmes spread them on the steps and studied them through his magnifying glass. A substitution code, he muttered, but the pattern is not consistent. There are extra parts, deliberate mistakes. This is not communication, but a test to join, perhaps for a new member. Then these were meant for Chilcot? Or from him, Holmes said darkly. He may have passed from student to teacher. Lestrade snorted. You can't mean the missing man is working with these crooks. The papers make him the victim. Victim or volunteer? Who can say? Holmes stood up, brushing the damp from his knees. But one thing is certain. He lives. There is too much ceremony for a dead body. The circle is still unbroken. We took the papers back to Baker Street, where Holmes spent most of the evening arranging them across the carpet in rows and diagonals, as though making some huge mosaic. I watched in silence, knowing that speaking at such moments was an interruption. At last he straightened, his face pale from deep thought. Watson, the spaces between the symbols match musical notes. It is a code built on rhythm, not language. Chilcot was a scholar of what we see, of the link between logic and sound. This is his doing. He crossed to his violin and plucked a single string. If the pattern holds, each group of numbers is a note. Listen. He drew the bow, and a series of low, deliberate notes filled the room. There was a plan in it, a hidden rhythm that seemed at first to have no shape, then slowly became a faintly familiar song. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Do you recognize it? I frowned. It sounds like a hymn. Indeed. Lux Benigna, the same song written in the edge of Chilcot's earlier paper at Oxford. Our scholar speaks in music now, not words. He played the series of notes again, slower this time, until the final note hung in the air and faded into silence. He is telling us where to look, Holmes said softly. The hymn's verse. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom. It is sung nightly at the chapel of St. Luke's Hospital by the river. Laurel, torch, and now light. Everything comes together there. By the time we reached the hospital, darkness had fallen completely. The gas lamps along the riverbank burned low, their reflections shivering on the black water. The building rose before us, its windows dimmed, except for one high above that glowed faintly, like a single eye keeping watch. We entered by a side gate. The hallway smelled of cleaning fluid and old linen. Somewhere a nurse's footsteps echoed and then stopped. This way, Holmes whispered, leading me up a narrow stair to the chapel. Its small inside was lit by 2 candles on the altar, their flames bending in the draught. The air was heavy with incense and the faint leftover feeling of a song. Holmes moved along the pews, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Someone has been here recently, he said. The candle ends are fresh, and that hymn book. See how the pages are still warm to the touch. He was here not half an hour ago. He knelt to check the floor near the reading stand. There, on the stone floor, a small object gleamed in the candlelight. A disc of brass engraved with the laurel and torch. Holmes lifted it delicately. The mark of the Brotherhood. Either a token dropped in a hurry or a message left on purpose. The trail grows hotter. Suddenly, the faintest rustle sounded behind us. Holmes spun around, his hand already at his coat pocket. A tall figure stepped from the gloom, his face half hidden by the hood of a priest's cloak. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the man's voice broke the silence, calm yet carrying a strange sound that made the hair rise on my neck. You seek him still, he said, but the scholar walks no longer in your world. Holmes's tone was cool and steady. Then perhaps you will show me the path to his new one. The man's head tilted, and though his face stayed in shadow, I caught the faint glint of metal at his throat. The collar, impossible to miss. Truth has its own price, Mr. Holmes. Be grateful you have not yet paid it. With that, he turned and moved swiftly through the side door, the edge of his cloak vanishing into darkness before we could reach him. Holmes darted after, but the hallway beyond opened only onto the empty courtyard. The gate swung slowly on its hinges, as if touched by unseen hands. Holmes stood without moving for several moments, the brass disc clenched in his palm. When he spoke, his voice was low and almost sad. He was here, Watson, our limping friend, the messenger of this strange belief. And now the torch passes on again, from hand to hand in secrecy. He looked back toward the chapel, where the candles flickered and went out one by one. This place is their safe spot, but it will not stay that way for long. For tonight at least, we have seen their light, and we know where it burns. We left the hospital in silence, the river wind cold against our faces. Somewhere behind us, a bell tolled midnight, and I could not shake the feeling that each strike marked a step deeper into the maze we had chosen to enter. Holmes spoke only once on the return journey. The game changes now, Watson. We no longer hunt a man, but an idea. And ideas, when once they are let loose, cannot easily be chained again. The next day started with a thin, yellowish light filtering through the fog, turning the world the color of dull brass. I woke to find Holmes at the window, already dressed and looking down on Baker Street, as though the cobblestones themselves might confess. The meeting at St. Luke's the night before had left a feeling of worry on us both. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, the brass token gleaming faintly between his fingers. "They are not hiding, Watson," he said at last without turning. "They are watching, and that is infinitely worse. You believe we are being followed? Watched, studied, perhaps even tested. Yes, when the hunter circles too near its prey. The prey must remember it is also being judged." He let the curtain fall back into place and turned to the table, where he had arranged the papers found at St. Paul's into 3 careful stacks. This, you see, is their belief turned into action, knowledge as a ceremony, secrecy as a holy book. Every act is a sign, every silence a signal. The laurel and the torch are not just decorations. They are the symbols of joining. Laurel for victory over not knowing, torch for the danger of enlightenment. Chilcott's tragedy is that he reached for both. He sat down, striking a match to the fire, and gestured for me to join him. "I have been at work on the code. Look at these groups." He pointed to the columns of numbers, now covered with faint penciled letters. When turned into musical spaces, they match exactly with the planetary degrees of old-time astronomy. Each page, therefore, codes not text, but coordinates. Coordinates of what? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. Of a place, perhaps, or an event. The pattern suggests a coming together. Venus over Mercury, the scholar's metaphor for harmony between what we see and what we think. It is a trick only a mind like Chilcott's could weave into a code. I suspect the message points to a meeting that will happen soon. Before I could reply, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face pale. "A message, sir." It was left by a boy who refused to wait. Holmes took the envelope, slid it open, and read silently. His eyes narrowed. "So, our watchers have chosen to speak." He handed it to me. The handwriting was elegant, neat, clearly foreign. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you have walked too far into a circle not your own. Leave the scholar to his purpose, or the torch shall burn you also. Tonight, when the moon touches the dome, we gather to complete what began. Come if you dare, but know that one who enters cannot leave without being enlightened." Holmes read my expression and smiled thinly. They wish to frighten us, Watson, or perhaps to test our courage. Either way, they have revealed what I most wanted, place and time. The dome, St. Paul's again, without a doubt. Tonight, then, when the moon rises high enough to cast its reflection on the dome's curve, they invite us to the joining ceremony. Lestrade was called within the hour. When Holmes explained the situation, the inspector turned pale. "You mean to walk straight into a nest of crazy people?" "It's suicide." "Not suicide, Inspector. Strategy. The snake's head can be struck only when it shows itself. You will station your men on the roads leading to St. Paul's, Ludgate Hill, Paternoster Row, and the South Side. No interference unless I signal. I mean to see this brotherhood face to face. And what about me? I asked. Holmes looked at me seriously. You, my dear fellow, will stand beside me. I shall need your eyes, your steady hand, and your revolver unloaded, if you please. We are hunters, not executioners. By the time dusk settled over London, the sky had cleared to a dull silver, and the moon, pale and unblinking, floated above the eastern roofs. We made our way on foot to St. Paul's, blending with the few evening walkers. Holmes moved with his usual calm, though I could sense the tension in the set of his shoulders. Look at the dome, he said as we reached the steps. Its curve reflects the moon like a mirror turned inward. That, Watson, is their symbol made of stone. Enlightenment trapped inside a cage. The great doors stood closed, but a faint thread of light glimmered at the crack. Holmes pressed one hand against the panel. It gave way with the slightest creak. Inside, the main hall lay in shadow, except for the distant glow of candles near the altar. The air was thick with incense and the murmur of low chanting. We moved forward silently, our steps swallowed by the huge space. As our eyes adjusted, we saw them, figures robed in black, maybe a dozen, arranged in a half-circle before the front of the church. At their center stood a single man in scholar's clothes, bareheaded, his hands tied loosely in front of him. Holmes breathed a single word. Chilcot. The scholar looked thinner than I remembered from his picture, his face tired, his expression deep in thought rather than fearful. Before him, on a marble stand, rested a bronze pot in which a small flame flickered, a torch of real and symbolic fire. The chant stopped, and one of the robed figures stepped forward. His voice carried through the hall with deliberate calm. Ambrose Chilcot, you have been called to bear the light you sought. The laurel is yours if your will proves strong. Do you come freely? I come, the scholar answered, his voice trembling but clear. Then speak the oath. Holmes moved forward, but I caught his sleeve. Not yet, he whispered. We must see it through. Chilcot raised his head and began to say words in a language I did not know. Harsh, rhythmic sounds that echoed strangely against the stone. At the end, the leader dipped a metal disc into the pot and pressed it briefly to the scholar's wrist. I caught the faint hiss of burned skin and Chilcot's quiet gasp. Holmes had seen enough. That will do, he said loudly. The circle turned as one. The leader's hood fell back, revealing the thin face of the man we had seen at St. Luke's. The same cold eyes, the same band of metal about his throat, gleaming like a ring of dull gold. Mr. Holmes, he said evenly, we expected you. Holmes's tone was polite, almost like he was just chatting. Then you will forgive me for not having replied. My friend and I have been following your society's work with a lot of interest. You walk in ignorance, the man replied. We are the keepers of that which must not die. The torch is not flame but knowledge. To bear it is to suffer enlightenment. This man, he gestured toward Chilcot, understands now what the world denies. The truth, not guarded, becomes evil. Holmes's eyes glinted. You mean that those who disagree with you must vanish into the fog? The leader smiled faintly. Vanishing is not death. It is a transformation. Your scholar stands at the doorway. He will thank us when he has crossed. Holmes took a step nearer, his voice still mild. And you, sir, what name do you bear among your group? Lefebvre is dead. Shall I call you Morar? For the first time, the man hesitated. Names are containers, Mr. Holmes. They crack under heat. I am merely the torchbearer. Then know this, said Holmes, and his voice hardened. Whatever belief you serve, it will not be practiced under the protection of England's law. Inspector Lestrade's men surround this building even as we speak. Your circle is broken. A ripple of worry passed among the robed figures, but their leader did not flinch. He raised one hand. Light cannot be bound by law. It escapes as flame escapes the lantern. Then, in a voice suddenly louder, put out the lamps. Instant darkness fell. I heard the shuffle of feet, the scrape of stone, and Holmes's cry, "Watson, keep close." Something struck me across the shoulder, sending me to one knee. The air filled with smoke, sharp and choking. A shot cracked, the echo multiplied tenfold inside the dome. I stumbled toward the sound of Holmes's voice. "Here," he called. I grabbed his arm just as a gust of night air rushed through the open doors. Lestrade's men poured in, their lanterns slashing gold across the gloom. Shapes darted through the haze, vanishing into the side aisles. When at last the smoke cleared, the hall lay scattered with fallen candles, overturned benches, and 2 caught followers groaning under the inspector's boot. But of Chilcot and the torchbearer there was no sign. Holmes looked at the scene in silence, while Lestrade barked orders. After a bit, he bent down beside the pot. The flame was out, but under the ashes lay a folded sheet of paper untouched by fire. He lifted it carefully and read the single line written on it. "Light moves onward." He straightened, his face unreadable. "He has escaped again, Watson. Not as a runaway, but as a convert. The scholar has chosen his enlightenment." Lestrade came over, flushed and angry. "Half of them slipped away through a passage behind the altar. Devil knows where it leads. We'll find them yet." Holmes shook his head. "No, Inspector. You will find only empty robes. The minds behind them are already elsewhere." He turned toward the great doors, where moonlight now poured across the floor in a pale stream. "It is done for tonight, but the fire they carry will burn again. Of that I have no doubt." Outside, the air was sharp and cold. The city stretched silent under the stars, and the dome of St. Paul's shone like a mirror of dimmed silver. Holmes looked up at it, his face deep in thought. "Do you see, Watson? They have chosen the oldest hiding place of all, the unseen. As long as men crave forbidden knowledge, there will always be those willing to sell it to them." He turned away then, his shadow lengthening along the steps. "The torch moves onward," he murmured, "but we shall follow where it leads." We walked home through the sleeping city, the echoes of the Brotherhood's chant still faint in my ears. I could not shake the image of Chilcot's calm, changed face in that circle of firelight. Yet under my worry stirred a deeper fear that Holmes himself, in his endless search for understanding, had stepped closer to that same dangerous flame. The next morning broke clear and bitter, as though the city itself tried to wash away the leftover feelings of the night before. The events at St. Paul's stayed in my mind with the unreal feeling of a fever dream, the chanting voices, the shimmer of the pot's flame, the calm craziness in Ambrose Chilcot's eyes as the brand touched his skin. Holmes, however, seemed not the least bit bothered. He had slept but a few hours, yet came out freshly shaven, his movements quick, his tone edged with the excitement of a man who has seen order inside chaos. "Watson," he said as he poured a small breakfast of coffee, "our enemies believe they have won. In truth, they have shown their hand." "You mean the Brotherhood?" "Just so. Their ceremony last night was not a desperate, unplanned act. It was an ending, the final point of months, perhaps years, of preparation. They have completed the joining of their scholar and sent him on some important task. The phrase 'light moves onward' was not just poetry, but an instruction. Chilcot is to carry the next stage forward, and it is up to us to figure out where that light now travels." He crossed to the fireplace shelf and unrolled a map of London, already marked with his usual scatter of pins and notes. "Look at this pattern," he continued. "Each site we have visited: Oxford Street, the Strand, the Docks, St. Luke's, And last night's meeting at St. Paul's forms a rough half-circle along the Thames. If we extend the curve eastward, it ends here. He tapped the map sharply. The Greenwich Observatory, the center of all earthly measurement, I murmured. Exactly. Where better for a society obsessed with the joining of light and knowledge to stage its next big show? The moon's passage, the turning of the stars. They are the natural language of such mystics. We go to Greenwich, Watson, and quickly, before their flame burns beyond our reach. By noon we had swapped the rattling streets of the city for the cleaner air of the river's edge. The fog had gone, leaving a pale sun that glittered on the water and gave the great domed buildings of the observatory a plain, stark beauty. Yet under that clearness hung a hush too deep for comfort. Even the seagulls seemed to circle tiredly above the hill. Asterisk. Holmes led the way up the steep path, his walk quick and tireless. He carried under his arm a small spyglass and a case of tools that looked for all the world like a surgeon's kit. "Do you remember," he said without turning, "that Lefebvre's ship, the Belle Helene, was tied up at Blackfriars on the night of his arrival? Her next registered trip was to start today from Greenwich Pier. A coincidence, perhaps, but the Brotherhood loves its symbols. They will gather here pretending to leave, and Chilcot will be among them." At the top, we found the great iron gates of the observatory, slightly open. No guard challenged our entrance. The courtyard lay empty, except for a single gardener raking dead leaves into a heap. Holmes questioned him briefly. The man, a mild fellow with weather-beaten cheeks, confirmed that a party of gentlemen had visited earlier that morning. Foreigners, he thought, one of them limping. They had been given special access to the Meridian room by order of a visiting scholar. Holmes's eyes glinted. The limping man again. "Come, Watson." Inside, the hush deepened into a feeling of respect. The tools gleamed like holy objects under glass, their brass dials catching the thin sunlight. As we went up the spiral stairs, I felt a strange sense of doing something wrong, as though we were interrupting some holy rite of reason itself. Holmes moved without hesitating, pausing only once to check a faint trace of ash on the floor. "Turkish blend," he murmured. "The scent is still here. We are close." We entered the Meridian chamber. The long brass strip that marked the line of zero longitude ran across the floor, gleaming faintly in the half-light. At the far end stood a table scattered with papers, measuring rods, and a small lantern whose flame burned with a steady blue color. The windows were curtained, and the air held the special sweetness of that same sticky smoke we had smelled before. Holmes stepped forward. "They have been here within the hour. See, the oil is still warm, the wick trimmed. But look, Watson, on the desk. There lay a single open book, filled with diagrams and math problems. At its center, someone had drawn the familiar symbol, the laurel and the torch surrounding a globe cut in half by the meridian. Under it, in Chilcot's hand, a phrase in Latin, Lux una est, sed cadet promultas. There is one light, but it falls through many. Holmes read it aloud, his tone almost full of longing. A motto for all who chase truth too far. They are trying to map enlightenment itself, to measure the unmeasurable. I admit, Watson, there is greatness even in their foolishness. He bent to check the globe on the stand. Its surface had been changed. The seas were covered with fine scratches, forming a pattern of circles inside circles, all coming together at a single point. Constantinople. Holmes drew in a sharp breath. So the flame returns to its source. The Brotherhood's heart lies not in London, but in the East, from which Lefebvre came. A soft sound broke the silence, the click of a door closing behind us. We turned sharply. Ambrose Chilcot stood in the doorway, pale and calm, his right wrist bandaged, his eyes as calm as a man who has settled all doubts within himself. "Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, I thought it likely you would come." "Then you know why," said Holmes. "You have placed yourself in danger, sir, body and mind both. These men mean you no enlightenment, only to be their servant." Chilcot smiled faintly. "You are mistaken. They have shown me a view broader than any I dared imagine. Knowledge is not something you own, Mr. Holmes. It is a sickness. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. They guard it not from greed, but from being misused. And yet they kill to protect it." "Unnecessary cutting," Chilcot replied. "Not all minds are fit to bear the light. Some must stay in shadow, or the world would go blind." Holmes's eyes never left him. "You speak their language fluently now. Tell me, what is the purpose of this symbol you draw on the world? Why Constantinople?" "The meridian marks the point where east and west divide," Chilcot said. "At the next full moon, the alignment of planets will place that line in shadow for a single hour. The Brotherhood means to use that hour to do a demonstration that will prove their belief." "A demonstration?" Chilcot's face turned almost angelic. "To show that thought itself can move things. That knowledge, when pure, has physical force. The math is here." He gestured to the diagrams. Lefebvre doubted. He interfered. "He is gone. I have taken his place." Holmes took a step nearer, his voice low but charged. "And when your experiment eats more than you plan, when the torch burns not just ignorance, but life itself, do you imagine the fire will spare you?" For the first time, a shadow of doubt crossed the scholar's face. "You speak as one who fears understanding." "I fear passion," said Holmes, "and I have seen too much of its damage to mistake it for reason." At that instant, the quiet was shattered by a sharp noise. The lantern flared, then fell over. Smoke rose in a twisting column. Chilcot's eyes widened. He darted forward to grab a paper from the table, but Holmes was quicker. With a single motion, he swept the book into his case and closed it. "No further tonight," he said. "The light moves onward indeed, but not with you." Chilcot's calm broke. "You cannot stop it," he cried. "It has already begun." He turned, striking the curtain aside. For a moment, the pale daylight poured over him, and I saw that the bandage on his wrist had bled through. Then he was gone, vanishing down the stairs with a speed that did not match his weakness. Holmes did not chase him. He stood at the window, watching as the scholar's figure grew smaller along the path below. "Let him go," he murmured. "The chase would get only the man, not the idea. And it is the idea that must be checked." We left the observatory as the sun dipped westward, carrying with us the saved book. On the hill's top, Holmes paused, looking back toward the dome that now glowed faintly in the evening light. "You see, Watson," he said, "for them, enlightenment is not a metaphor, but a machine. They seek to use intellect as others use steam. Were they to succeed, the result would not be enlightenment, but the tyranny of thought." "Then Chilcot," I said. "He walks between faith and madness. When the moon next reaches her fullness, we shall learn whether he has crossed that line." That night in Baker Street, Holmes worked long into the early hours, figuring out the math problems in the book. I wrote my notes in silence, not wanting to bother the intensity of his focus. The fire burned low. The lamplight gleamed on the tools. At last he looked up, tiredness etched into the planes of his face. "It is worse than I imagined," he said softly. "This is not just an idea. These numbers describe an experiment using focused heat, mirrors, and magnets. An attempt to copy the very conditions of the sun's fire. They mean to light their truth on the earth." I stared at him. "Then we must stop them." "We shall try," he said simply. "For the moon will reach its height in 3 nights' time, and by then the Brotherhood will have gathered in the East End to make their proof. The torch burns low, but it burns still." He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, the weary satisfaction of discovery shadowed by dread. Outside, the city slept under a rising mist, and from somewhere far along the river came the sad toll of a bell. It sounded to my ears less like a warning than a dark prediction. For the next 2 days, London existed in a kind of waiting tension, as though the whole city awaited some unseen signal. A strange heaviness hung in the air, not unlike the stillness before a thunderstorm. Holmes barely spoke, and when he did, his words came out short and distracted, his mind clearly fixed on the math problems recovered from Chilcott's book. I've seen him in many states of work, triumphant, impatient, even hopeless, but never before so taken over by a sense of coming discovery. He had turned our living room into a real laboratory of mirrors, prisms, and lenses. The curtains were drawn, and the single lamp at the center of the room had been fitted with a series of reflecting plates that cast its light into trembling geometric patterns on the ceiling. Over these shifting shapes, Holmes moved restlessly, notebook in hand, muttering pieces of Latin and French, his thin face sharpened by focus. "The Brotherhood's plan," he said at last, "is as elegant as it is monstrous." Chilcott's notes describe the use of curved mirrors to bring beams of light together into a single focus, what he calls the point of unshadowing. At that focus lies a mineral mix of a dangerous nature. Under enough heat, it may light up on its own. The result, if done on a large scale, would be a flash bright enough to scar the very air. "Surely you are exaggerating," I protested. No mere scholar's experiment could threaten more than his own safety. He looked at me, and in that gaze I saw a seriousness that silenced all further protest. "Remember what the brothers say, that knowledge itself can move things. What if they have indeed discovered a trigger of immense energy, yet think its power comes from ideas rather than science? In their blindness, they would unleash destruction and call it enlightenment." He turned back to his tools. "The date, the hour, the coordinates. They all come together tomorrow night when the moon reaches its highest point. The East End, an abandoned glass-making factory on Narrow Street, Limehouse. Chilcott will try his demonstration there." I asked how he could be certain. The book had a rough sketch of the place, and I've checked its existence through city records. A wide room, a high roof of cracked window panes, perfect for their mirrors. They believe it's a secret. They are mistaken. He fell silent, asterisk. His face set in that serious calm which was his mask before danger. At last, he said quietly, "Watson, this time you must stay behind. Indeed, I shall do no such thing." He gave a thin smile. "I was afraid of that. Very well. If you insist on coming with me, you will obey my orders without question. The Brotherhood has crossed from belief to crime. There will be no reasoning with them now." The following evening found us winding through the maze of Limehouse alleys, the air thick with the smells of the river and the faint metallic smell of smoke. We moved in silence, the fog drifting in from the wharves like a slow ocean wave. Holmes had brought Lestrade and a handful of plain-clothed men who followed at quiet distances. From the east came a pale glimmer of moonlight breaking through torn clouds. "There," Holmes whispered, pointing to a dark shape rising above the warehouses. The skeleton-like ruin of the old glass-making factory. Its windows were shattered, its roof patched with pieces of iron and glass that caught the moonlight like scales. A faint hum reached us, rhythmic and mechanical, completely out of place in the sleeping streets. We crept closer until the great doorway loomed before us. Holmes pressed his ear against the rusted iron. "Listen." From inside came the murmur of voices broken by the scrape of metal, then a sharper sound, the clear click of a lever being pulled. Holmes nodded once to Lestrade. "Now." The inspector signaled his men. With a wrench, the door swung inward, and we rushed into the huge inside. The sight that met our eyes was one of dreadful beauty. The cave-like hall had been turned into a cathedral of light. Mirrors were arranged in perfect balance, each one reflecting the glow of a single blue-white flame that burned at the center of the room. Around it stood a dozen figures in black robes, their faces hidden, their hands raised as if in prayer. Before the flame knelt Ambrose Chilcot. His bandaged wrist gleamed faintly where the brand had burned it. Holmes's voice rang out, "In the name of the law, stop your work." The circle turned as one. For an instant, the reflected beams caught Holmes full in the face, and he seemed a figure cut from the same brightness he challenged. Then chaos exploded. One of the mirrors shattered, scattering a rain of glass. Another beam struck the wall and set the dust on fire. Lestrade's men surged forward. Two of the robed figures ran toward the back, only to be stopped. I saw Holmes dart across the floor, his cloak flaring as he grabbed Chilcot by the shoulder and dragged him back from the blazing machine. The scholar resisted with surprising strength, his eyes wild with excitement. "You fool!" he cried. "You would stop creation itself." Holmes struck the lever aside. "Creation requires control, sir, or it falls into chaos." The machine screamed, a rising metallic wail as the mirrors bent from the heat. Light flared in blinding sheets, and I threw myself to the ground. When my vision cleared, I saw Holmes pulling a cable free, sparks showering around him. The blue flame sputtered, flared once more, then died, leaving the room plunged into smoky darkness. The silence that followed was broken only by the drip of water from the ceiling and the harsh breathing of men. Lestrade, his coat torn, was already tying the wrists of the captured followers. The others had fled into the night. Holmes stood beside the put-out machine, his face pale but calm. Chilcot lay on the floor, stunned but awake, his expression one of disbelief rather than defeat. "You do not understand," he murmured. "It was working." The light obeyed me. Holmes knelt beside him, his voice almost gentle. "It obeyed no one, Mr. Chilcot. You tried to command a force that recognizes no master. Be grateful that it spared you long enough to learn to be humble." The scholar gave a broken laugh. "You think me humbled?" "No," Holmes enlightened. "The Brotherhood will rise again. Others will complete what I began." "Then let them rise," said Holmes quietly. "For every flame that burns, there is a fire extinguisher at hand." At his signal, Lestrade's men led Chilcot and the captives away. Holmes stayed, checking the broken machine. The mirrors, bent and blackened, reflected only pieces of their own ruin. On one of the fallen panels, the laurel and torch symbol had melted into an abstract scar, the lines twisted into meaningless curves. As we came out into the open air, the first breath of dawn touched the river with silver. The fog was lifting. Holmes paused at the doorway and looked back at the smoldering ruin. "Do you smell it, Watson?" "Smoke," I said. "And burnt oil also. The faintest trace of camphor," he replied. "Resin from their secret ink. Even in destruction, their belief insists on a signature. They would turn a huge fire itself into a letter." We walked in silence toward the waiting cab. Behind us, the glass-making factory crackled softly as the fire ate its own evidence. Lestrade, always the practical man, appeared satisfied. "You've done it again, Mr. Holmes. London owes you thanks, though I doubt it knows for what." Holmes smiled faintly. "London seldom knows what threatens it until the threat is past. Keep Chilcot under guard. Inspector. Treat him as neither a prisoner nor a prophet. He will talk soon enough." As the cab rattled homeward through streets, slowly waking up to morning, I studied my friend. The tiredness of victory had set its lines on his face. Yet there remained in his expression something unsettled, a bit of the awe he had felt before the Brotherhood's strange cathedral of mirrors. At last he spoke. almost to himself. You remember their motto, Watson. Light teaches, but burns. There is truth in that. We chase understanding as moths chase flame, and we are surprised when our wings are burned. Yet without that danger, would man ever rise above not knowing? I wonder. He turned his gaze toward the faint glow in the east, where the sun began to break the horizon. The experiment failed, but the idea lives on. Somewhere, even now, another mind will try to light it again. And perhaps when that day comes, there will be no Holmes to snuff it out. I could find no answer. The cab rolled on through the thinning mist, the city stirring to its ordinary life, not knowing how narrowly it had escaped the passion of one man's search for knowledge. At Baker Street, as Holmes collapsed tiredly into his chair, the dawn light touched his profile, carving it in lines of gold and shadow. He stared into the fireplace, where the first coals of morning glowed. "Do you see, Watson?" he said softly. "The torch has been put out, yet the embers remain. It is our curse and our duty to watch them." And as the city outside went back to its uncaring hum, I wondered whether the true enlightenment Holmes spoke of was not in the Brotherhood's fire, but in his own steady determination to hold the line between brilliance and ruin. London had gone back to its usual rhythm, that great heart of stone and steam, beating once more without caring about the dramas played out inside its blood vessels. Cabs rattled through the fog. Newsboys shouted gossip from the curb, and the Thames, huge and not bothered, rolled eastward under the bridges as though it had not, 2 nights before, been a witness to a light that might have swallowed half the city. Yet in our rooms at Baker Street, there was a silence unlike any I'd known there. A silence not of peace, sir, but of what comes after. The air itself seemed bruised. Holmes had not spoken for hours. He sat by the fire in his dressing-gown, his head bowed, his long fingers steepled before him. On the table lay the leftovers of the Brotherhood's book, burned pages, bent diagrams, a few surviving symbols of the laurel and torch. Their shapes were blurred where the heat had licked them. The morning light filtering through the window turned them almost see-through, ghostly maps of a passion now put out. I dared at last to break the stillness. "You have saved London from a disaster, Holmes. Why this sadness?" He looked up slowly. His eyes, though clear, carried a depth of tiredness that went beyond the physical. "Because, my dear Watson, one does not put out an idea just by pouring water on its flame. The Brotherhood is scattered, not destroyed. Their belief is nothing more than the ancient fever that haunts all human searching. A belief that truth, once grabbed, must make its owner godlike. Such faith cannot be arrested. It can only move." He stood up and moved to the window, where the street's murmur reached us faintly. Even now, the scholar sits in a cell at Scotland Yard, making new arguments from the ruins of his failure. I have stood against crime in many forms: greed, jealousy, revenge, but never against faith disguised as intellect. That, Watson, is an enemy as hard to catch as light itself. Before I could reply, there came a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram, her face half worried, half curious. Holmes tore it open, scanned the short message, and handed it to me. It was from Lestrade. "Chilcot escaped early this morning. Guard found unconscious. No trace of struggle. Brand symbol burned into cell wall." Holmes said nothing. He just turned back to the fire and stared into it for a long moment, and murmured, "The torch passes on." He reached for his violin and, without tuning it, began to draw from it a series of low, deliberate notes. They were unlike any song I'd heard him play before, neither sad nor happy, but thoughtful, as if he was trying to find through sound the pattern that logic could not give. I sat in silence until he set the instrument aside and said softly, "We shall find him again." Of course, Men who believe they are chosen are rarely happy to stay hidden. That afternoon we paid a visit to Lestrade at the yard. The inspector received us with a mix of annoyance and real worry. "It's the devil's own trick," he declared. The cell door was locked from the inside, the window barred, and yet the fellow's gone. The guard swears he saw a flicker of light before losing consciousness. A blue fire, he called it. Likely his imagination. Holmes checked the small cell himself. The smell of burned stone still hung faintly in the air. On the wall, just above the bed, the symbol had indeed been burned. The laurel and torch were crudely drawn, the lines uneven yet clearly there. Under it, scratched with a nail or bit of wire, were the words "Lux Ascendit." The light rises. Holmes's mouth tightened. He has help, Lestrade. He could not have done this without partners on the inside, or influence from outside. Then you think the Brotherhood is still active? I think, Holmes replied, that faith, once lit, needs no group to keep going. A single mind is enough to light it again. He turned toward me. Watson, the marks on the wall. See how the burn widens toward the center. The heat was focused at a single point. Chilcot has rediscovered a small part of his machine. Then we are not safe, I said quietly. Safety, Holmes murmured, is the last illusion of civilization. Outside the yard, the fog had returned, drawn up from the river in long curling veils that hid even the nearest lamps. Holmes walked quickly, his coat drawn close, his thoughts clearly moving. There is a pattern to his escape, Watson. The Brotherhood's belief follows a path from west to east, from not knowing to supposed enlightenment. Oxford Street, the Strand, the river, Greenwich, each a waypoint on that line. There is but one. Endpoint left, the farthest eastward reach of London's soul, the docks at Shadwell. We arrived there by evening. The river, swollen by the tide, lapped slowly against the sides of tied-up ships. Lamps flickered dimly through the mist, their reflections shivering on the black water. The warehouses stood empty, except for the occasional watchman's lantern gliding like a ghost light between the sheds. Holmes moved with deliberate quiet, pausing often to study the ground or to listen. Near the end of a narrow dock, he stopped. A faint shimmer played across the surface of the water, though no light burned above it. There, he whispered. Do you see it? I followed his gaze and caught it. A trembling reflection, blue and pale, deep under the surface. Then, just as suddenly, it vanished. Holmes knelt at the edge, dipping his gloved fingers into the water. Warm, he said softly. Warmer than the air. Chilcot has been here within the hour. A faint sound echoed from one of the nearby warehouses. A creak, then the slam of a door. Holmes stood up at once, signaling for silence. We moved forward through the fog until the looming shape of the building appeared before us. Its windows were dark, yet a narrow beam of pale light escaped from the gap under the door. Holmes drew his revolver. Carefully, Watson, he whispered. The man we face now is not just desperate. He believes he is immortal. He pushed the door open. The inside was huge and empty, except for a single machine at the center, a tripod, supporting a small mirror angled toward a lantern of strange design. Beside it stood Chilcot, his coat torn, his hair a mess, yet his eyes burned with a feverish clearness. He did not jump at our entrance. You are too late, he said calmly. I have perfected the focusing. What failed at Limehouse shall succeed here. Holmes took one careful step forward. You escaped your cell to repeat your foolishness. For what purpose? To prove, Chilcot replied, that thought and light are one, that the mind, properly focused, may transform the world. You saw only danger. I see salvation. The flame I light will not destroy. It will transform. You speak as one who is drunk on an idea, Holmes said quietly. Look around you. You stand alone in darkness, trying to call the sun. Does that strike you as enlightenment or madness? Chilcot smiled faintly. Madness, perhaps, but divine madness. He turned to the lantern, adjusting a lever. The blue light flared again, washing the walls with trembling color. The heat struck us like the breath of an open furnace. Holmes lunged forward, grabbing the machine by its frame. "Watson, help me!" he shouted. Together, we pushed the mirror aside. There was a sound like the tearing of silk, and a flash of burning brightness that filled the room. The mirror shattered. Shards flew outward with a metallic scream. I felt myself thrown backward, my ears ringing. When the glare faded, the warehouse lay in ruins. The air shimmered with heat. Chilcot was gone. In his place, on the burned boards, lay only the remains of his bandage, and the faint mark of the laurel symbol burned into the floor. Holmes rose unsteadily, his face pale in the dying glow. "He has eaten himself," he whispered. The torchbearer, indeed. We stumbled out into the night air. The river wind cooled our faces, carrying with it the scent of smoke and salt. For a long time, neither of us spoke. At last, Holmes said quietly, "He sought to command light, and light has claimed him. The cycle ends as it began." Back at Baker Street, the dawn found Holmes once more by the window, the city beyond it waking up in shades of gray and gold. "You will write it as you see fit, Watson," he said, his voice quiet. "Yet leave out the details of the machine. Knowledge of such a kind must vanish with its creator. The world is not ready for miracles born of arrogance." He turned from the window, the faintest shadow of a smile on his lips. Still, I cannot help but feel a bit of pity. He sought enlightenment and found complete destruction. But perhaps in some deep sense, they are the same thing. I watched as he settled into his chair, striking a match for his pipe. The flame flared, small and ordinary, its reflection dancing in his eyes. "Light teaches," he murmured, echoing the Brotherhood's motto, "but burns." Outside, London brightened under the rising sun, not knowing the danger that had so narrowly passed it by. The streets filled with carts, the bells of St. Paul's tolled the hour, and somewhere beyond the fog, the river carried away the last trace of the scholar who had dared to summon fire from the heavens. Holmes drew deeply on his pipe, breathed out, and said in that quiet tone I have heard only when the storm of his mind gives way to sad thoughts, "The torch is out, Watson. Let us hope it is never lit again." And so ended the case of the vanished scholar of Oxford Street, a mystery that began with smoke and telegrams, and ended with a light too fierce for human eyes to bear.